The only regret that we have is that we didn't do it sooner.
I'm Holly, that's Ray, and this is our home, Sabado. Subscribe to tag along on the adventure. Long time no see. We took a little bit of a break from filming because our boat was an absolute disaster. There were wires and tools just everywhere, and we had a few days without power while the STT Marine Services guys were finishing up the wiring. But I am happy to say we've been off the dock now for almost a week, living with the new system, and it has been really great. I'll insert a few clips of what the final product looks like, but we've been able to keep our Starlink on 24/7, we've done laundry, we've made water, we've used our water heater, we've used all of our new galley appliances, and the system has handled it all easily. I think Jesse is on his way back over now just to do a final systems check, and then I'll film just like a wrap-up sit-down chat with him.
So it's been about a week since we finished the primary install and you guys left Crown Bay Marina, and you've been out on anchor in a couple of different harbors around the USVI. So how's the system been running?
Amazing. We're using our air fryer multiple times a day. We're using our electric kettle, making hot water on battery. We're really just living life as if we were on a dock electrically. It's been great. We haven't run the generator except for testing purposes. Mm-hmm. We are using about 6 kilowatts a day or so, and the solar you put in is producing about 6.5, exactly what you said it was going to put in.
Yeah, it's good to hear when systems are working exactly as you design them. You know, and it's kind of funny. Like, you know, I'll be checking in on the Victron virtual monitoring that they have, and I can even tell when you guys are your routines. You know, I can see when you're making coffee and when you're making lunch. It's interesting. You see the spikes in current going out and the little bit of voltage drop that you get with lithium. But you know, lithium's nice. You know, you drop from 13.2 to maybe 12.8, 12.9.
Oh, with a heavy load.
With a real heavy, with running, you know, a 1500 watt load with your with an Instapot air fryer.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And we wake up in the morning and put a heavy load on the battery system to make breakfast and to make coffee, and we still have over 13 volts. It's really, I know it's a term that's overused, a game changer, but I mean, it's fantastic. The only regret that we have is that we didn't do it sooner. We have, I think, total about 1,700 watts, just under, of solar on this boat. Mm-hmm. And I have seen way more than that going into the batteries. We've had more than 2 kilowatts of solar going into the batteries. Why do we get so much solar over the rating? Yeah,
it's internal resistance of the batteries. This is another hidden benefit of lithium, is they charge that much quicker because the internal resistance is so much lower than AGM or lead acid. So you get about a 15% bump that people don't really account for a lot of times when they're calculating how much solar you need to balance that lithium amp hour capacity. So with your system, it's a nice balanced system. We have enough solar that on your average day, you're going to be able to keep going, and you could even deal with 1 or 2 cloudy days without really having to worry. And then with the addition of the 2 Phoenix chargers and the Multi Plus, I mean, we were just running a test, and a little over an hour, we put 60% back into these batteries. I mean, we're still well within what KiloVault recommends for amps going into a battery in a continuous basis.
I saw over 300 amps going into the batteries, running the generator, which is crazy. And there's no solar to speak of. There's very little solar.
Yeah, it's a cloudy day today, so you know, it was nice to see the system performing. We didn't see a huge heat increase from any of the battery chargers. Everything was running, you know, as we intended. We saw a little bit in the electrical closet, and the recommendation there would be to add some cooling fans, some brushless computer fans on a external thermostat, and you could actually do it on on the internal thermostat on the Multi Plus. But as we kind of discussed on that upgrade, if we do it with an external thermostat, if you're using just the Phoenixes for whatever reason, you still would turn those on. And the Phoenixes are really, they're a nice piece of kit, but they don't have their own internal cooling source. They do it based on heat sinks. So adding some airflow over those heat sinks will really help those units cool down.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's definitely something we're going to implement. But, you know, that said, to us, it seems like a fairly rare occurrence to need to even run the generator. I mean,
yeah, the way I would use it if this was my boat is, you have a couple cloudy days in a row and you don't want to listen to the generator go on for, 6-7 hours. You can just turn on all your battery chargers and be done in 2 to 3.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's nice. And like I had said when we had originally talked about your design, you were thinking 600 amp hours was going to be enough. And I was like, really want to get that up around 900, because from what we found on cruising boats, 900, you start adding more equipment. You add the electric kettle, you add the air fryer, the induction burner. When you start adding those things, you just increase that load a little bit more. So adding that third battery took care of those increases that you guys put into the system.
Yeah, and I think, the only reason that we would want more battery capacity was if we were going to run some amount of air conditioning off the batteries. And for us, going to the electric cooking doesn't add a bunch of heat to the space.
Yeah.
And we're on anchor, all the time. And so we open the windows and we get the flow of air through here, and we're not seeing a need for us to have air conditioning. And we live full-time in the tropics, so we get used to it.
You guys are kind of our ideal client because you don't want to live aboard in a condo. You realize you're living aboard in a boat. So you're not looking at running all 4 air conditioners 24/7 and things like that. You're going to open up hatches. You're going to live on anchor. You're going to not be in marinas all the time. So that gives this system, gives us a little bit better info in the design. That's why we do the pre-questionnaire, to find out what do people want. Do they want to sit at anchor with their air conditioning running because they're on Zoom meetings all day and things like that? We do have clients that have been like that. Everybody uses their boat different.
So KiloVault has sponsored us, which is fantastic. One of the things that they did when they sent the batteries was they sent this sheet that was very detailed on what we needed to do before we connected the batteries to anything. They also included a charger. Can you talk about what you had to do to get these batteries ready to be installed?
Yeah, so they sent out a charger because one of the key things before you put a number of batteries in parallel, whether that's 2 or 6, whatever you're going to do, is you need to charge them all to the exact same voltage in the correct manner. Now, most battery chargers on boats can't do that for lithium because they have things like adaptive absorption charges, or you're not allowed to program the voltage at which you go from bulk to absorption charge correctly. So they sent you a charger that could do that. And it's a great charger. We just don't use it because we deal with a number of manufacturers. So we have what's called a benchtop power supply. And those benchtop power supplies allow us to set what those voltages are and what the amperage is going into the batteries based on what the manufacturer. I never go by memory. I'll always go to the manufacturer's recommendations while I'm setting up everything. We monitor it with our best multimeters, which are the Fluke multimeters, because they're much better units than, say, a Klein or cheaper units that you might get at like a Home Depot. And we don't allow that to go unattended. We're constantly monitoring, we're looking at it, we're seeing to make sure that we go from constant current charging to constant voltage charging at the right amount, and that we see the tail current coming down. And that's a key thing, I think, to making sure that these systems stay in balance through use. Because if you start with batteries that are out of balance and then you start putting high loads, either charging or discharging on them, you're just going to exaggerate that issue. Now, one of the benefits of KiloVault, and one of the reasons we really like this product and rep it, is they're working on making their batteries talk to each other. And that's something that you don't get at their price point. Anything that's at that price point or lower, you can't make the batteries talk to each other. Now, when they have the PlusNet come online, which is supposedly coming very soon, they'll now be able to talk to each other. So not only are the cells balancing inside each individual battery, but you'll be able to balance each individual battery compared to the others. So that if one's at 13.8 at full charge and the others are at 13.9 or 14, they'll be able to balance that out so that they start keeping themselves within that same unit. We've done a lot of KiloVault installs, and we found once they're balanced, they almost never go out of balance unless you abuse the system. We have a couple of boats that have discharged them all the way down to the point of BMS shutdowns, and then we have to go in and rebalance charge their batteries. But on a normal boat where they haven't abused them that way, they stay balanced very well.
One of the things that I'd like your comment on is what it's like going into a production boat and looking at your plans and how the factory wired it, and the things that are common that you see that that you need to change or address?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest issues we find is a wiring diagram from a manufacturer is almost never as it actually was installed. We'll always find small changes that were done. With something like Lagoon uses harnesses for a lot of their wiring. So for them, it becomes another layer of difficulty in us interpreting some of the changes that might have happened, or trying to find where a system may be so we can tie into it. Because they'll do the same wiring harness, whether it's a 110 boat, a 230 boat, or like a 240, US 3-leg boat. They use the same wiring harness. So when we go through the boat, we'll see things like wire sizes that are somewhat undersized. So before we started this project, you essentially had 2 circuits for outlets on this boat. And they were using a 14 gauge wire, and they were split port and starboard. So all of your port outlets worked on one set of wires that were running through 14 gauge, daisy chain from outlet to outlet. On the starboard side was the same. When we started talking about some of the things that you guys were talking about adding, like the air fryer, the electric kettle, we made the determination that we really want to separate some of those items out, put them on their own breakers, and rewire them so that we could put in a 10 gauge wire. So when you start pulling 1800 watts through your air fryer, you have adequate wire size in there to handle that amperage. So we find that a lot where boats have, set up for one use, and they're set up for their factory, and they meet a nice price point. But when you start adding and changing how you're going to use the boat, you do need to look at some of those details. Then you find things unexpected. We found somebody at some point had cut one of your major wires that was going between your large load distribution and your batteries, the way they were set up before, and had put a 2-aught butt connector in there.
We'll put a photo. Because it was surprising, because the only people who have done electrical work on this boat, that type of electrical, the big projects, have been the factory or a Lagoon authorized service center.
And obviously nobody told you about it because it was a surprise when we found it, which is one of the things that I always dislike when we find surprises like that and the owner doesn't know. If you had known about it and knew it was something you had to watch and make sure it wasn't even really truly heat shrunk, it wasn't really protected from elements, and then it was a large butt connector. We only like using those in emergency situations just to get a boat back into harbor. We would never use that as a permanent fix. The right answer is you run a new wire. Yeah. Which is what we ended up doing. We ran some nice 4-aught. So if you look at the proposed diagram versus the as-built, you'll see that there was some 3-aught that we had planned on remaining in place with your system that we actually replaced with 4-aught. And that was one of the reasons that we found some of those items.
The other item that you addressed that wasn't originally planned was the generator wiring. And this generator was installed ex-factory because of issues with obtaining a generator at the time the boat was built. But it was still installed by an authorized company for Lagoon. Maybe you can just explain what you found on that generator.
So one of the things we see, and we see this in a lot of the European production boats, is they use a auto transfer switch that's really designed for houses. In Europe, they use these things called mini circuit breakers. They're a little bit different than the circuit breakers we see in U.S. houses. They are meant to mount on a dim rail, and they have tensioners that tighten down on wires. And if you use a torque screwdriver to actually check them, you'll actually see that, especially with marine grade thin strand, when you tighten them down and then you leave for an hour and come back, you no longer hit torque. You have to tighten them again. I had mentioned a Rod Collins article, Marine How To. He just this week put out a new one on the use of ferrules and these type of connections and why they're important. And he goes through and demonstrates that. So again, if you go to his page, Marine How To, there's a really good article on ferrules and using and these type of breakers and things like that. But when we found those auto transfer switches, we have them fail at least 3 or 4 times a year when you have to do an emergency bypass so they can at least run their generator. Now they can't run on shore power. Sometimes they even start small fires. Even on yours, we found a little bit of browning around them. We didn't like that type of setup. So we eliminated that.
And this generator is only run for 500 hours.
Right.
That's probably why we didn't see a bigger problem.
Where a lot of these charter boats will run for almost that a week. You know, they're running nonstop every night. In 1 week, they surpass what you've done the whole time you've owned this vessel. So we replaced that. We went with a Blue Seas selector breaker. It's a much better choice. Blue Seas makes great products. But it also allows you now to completely eliminate load on your generator without having to go into a hidden breaker inside a closet that required you to move some clothes and open up a panel that isn't made to get at. So it's a nice setup, and we're actually going to modify that further. In a new wiring diagram, we've talked about adding a breaker out at the generator. And you didn't have that originally. That's something that we feel is important because essentially all the wire between the generator and that new Blue Seas breaker we installed is not really protected. You want your protection as close to your source of power as possible. So we'll add another panel next to the generator enclosure inside the forward locker, and that will allow you to have the protection of all of that wire going through there. And we're also going to add a Victron ET112, which will allow you to get amperage and current and frequency sensing for your entire generator load through your Victron system.
So having a breaker as close to the source as possible is important. One of the other things that is super important that I've just recently learned is having the bonding between the ground and the neutral for US spec. Is it the same as I think it's just,
yeah, in general it's the same.
So that's important to have as close to the source as possible, which we found was weird on this boat.
Right, to have things like your GFCI and your ELCRs that are made to give you your ground fault protection work appropriately, you do need to have the system bonded at the correct point. So with most boats, you see 2 to 3 points of that connection, depending on whether you have a generator in it. On shore power, the pedestal itself has that connection in it. So that's done on the shore power side, not on the boat side. When you have a good inverter charger like a Victron, there's actually a relay inside the unit that will do that bonding for you when you go from charger to inverter. So that now on inverter, you're bonded, your ground fault will work correctly. On your generator, it was bonded but not necessarily in the right spot. So that means if you ever had hot voltage leaking through your ground, your generator would see that. So if you were on shore power and there was a mistake, say, in the shore power pedestal, and you went to go work on your generator, you may have found accidental hot on your ground, which could have led to electrocution, damage to the unit. There's a lot of reasons for that. So right now we have it bonded on the generator side of that new Blue Seas breaker. When we put in the new ELCR breaker up near the unit, that's where we'll do that bonding.
Yeah, okay. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you changed on your original plan once you got in here and looked at things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so in the new as-built diagram, one of the things we did is we added the Phoenixes. So originally we didn't have the Phoenixes included in the install. I think that's a great addition because it allows your generator runtime to be much shorter when you need to run.
It adds up to 100 amp of
additional charging. Yeah. So you can charge, if you didn't have solar on at all, if you're in a full rain-out day, you're going to charge at 210 amps with the way we've deregulated things.
And so if we brought our batteries down, I think we've said that we can go as low as 20%.
20% is the general accepted, yeah.
So if we did the generator run, we could have those batteries charged in
3 hours.
3 hours.
I mean, this morning in a probably about an hour and 10-minute test, we went from 64% to 91% in an hour.
That's incredible.
So now we had solar going at that period, so we were seeing over 300 at certain times. But it's a game changer, again, cliche term, but it's a game changer when it comes to how quick you can charge. And that means it's less time you have to think about your battery and electrical system when you're out cruising, which is really what all of us want. We don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about, do I have to charge the batteries? Do I have to sit here and babysit a generator?
Can I make water?
Yeah, can I make water?
Yeah. And what other things did you find that caused you to change the way your original plan was designed?
So we had talked about, we found the 2-aught crimp, 2-aught butt connector that we found in one of your lines. So originally we were just going to fuse that line and not upgrade it. We upgraded that line instead. We found that one of the things that Lagoon uses that's an unbelievable piece of kit, but we can't find a U.S. source for, is these Ampere large load distributors. So that right now that's powering your windlass and your 2 power winches. They're great pieces. They had a second one that was all that it was doing was powering your inverter. Now we took that out because we didn't need it, gave us space to install one of your Phoenixes. But now we can use those big bus bar systems that are in the Ampere distributors to help us put load back into the system without having to have too many connections on the bus bars we installed in your electrical closet. In the electrical closet, the wires that went from your old inverter into your system were undersized. They were the European equivalent of a 12 AGW wire. We went with an 8 there instead. And
that's a big step up.
It's a big step up, but you also have gone to an inverter charger. So now not only do you have your AC loads going through there, but when you're running that in charger mode, you're now running 120 amp battery charger through there. So to account for that difference, that's why we went from the 12 to an 8. Some installers may have left that and not done that step up. We just feel that that's not appropriate. We want to make sure that everything's done. We also took apart, you had 2 additional mini circuit breaker boxes. One that was essentially an auto transfer for your outlets, so that if you were using them on shore power versus generator or inverter, it would transfer which was being powered then. We can do that in the multi-plus, so we don't need those. Then you had another box that had items like your washer dryer. We took that out, made that into one box, and now you have one smaller box that has proper breakers for your output for your multi-plus, for your sub panel, which is up here next to your nav station, and then we also could do the 2 outlets that are now dedicated towards kitchen cooking and your washer dryer. So it's changes like that that take a little bit more time that you don't really anticipate when you get into a project, but they make a big difference in how the system performs.
Nice. Excellent. It was eye-opening to me, the level of depth that you and your team had to go through to ensure that everything was done properly. And it wasn't just your install, but it was making sure that what was done at the factory was correct too. It's got to be tough in your position as a service provider to come on a boat and do this level of work, and then from that point on, anything bad that happens,
yep,
people point the finger at you. So that's why you go through.
It's not just that. It's not just the liability side, but also just the. We view this whole your entire electrical system as a system. The AC side, the DC side, the batteries, your charging sources. That's all one whole system. So if we tried to look at that and just come in and have, you know, a very narrow tunnel vision and say all that we're doing is batteries, I'm just going to change out batteries, I'm not going to pay attention to the rest, it's not going to perform like we intended. It's not going to perform as our customers expect. So the only way to do this, in our opinion, is you view everything as a system, and you want to make sure that entire system is set up and is going to run correctly.
So here's a question for you. Do you ever have a potential client come to you and want you to do something very specific that you have to turn down?
Yeah, I won't name the boat, but last year we had at least 4 clients that we turned down because they wanted us to be narrowly focused without actually looking at full systems. So we had somebody that had installed cheap Chinese lithium batteries, and they wanted us to come in and put in a multi-plus on a system, but they didn't want to address other deficiencies we saw on our initial analysis, so we told them, sorry, we're just not the client. DIY builds. Lithium started with DIY builds. It wasn't, you couldn't get these manufactured batteries, what people call drop-in, for years. When they first came out, you had to buy the raw cells, you had to build a BMS, you couldn't even buy a BMS that just was a plug-and-play unit then. And we still see people that come in with the DIY systems, and we look at what components they have and say, we don't want to get involved. You're using substandard components, you're using grade B cells instead of grade A, you don't have a good BMS plan, and we're just not going to be involved in it. So we do turn down clients all the time that aren't willing to look at their entire system.
But what other things that might not be specifically electrical in nature do you guys see on boats that have had upgrades, modifications made?
Yeah, the industry term is scope creep. So we come in with a certain scope that we're planning to do, and then you start on the project and you start finding things that are different than what you intended. A big one for you was when we removed the wind turbines and the legs that supported them to take them to be to have caps welded on. We found out that the backing plates that were installed weren't actually making contact with the hull. It's something we see a lot on boats because the hulls are never flat, and people will take a aluminum backing plate and just bolt it right up underneath the side and think, I'm good, I put a big backing plate on. For your port side, we were seeing that you were only making contact in about a 1-inch wide by 3-inch long section. The rest of that backing plate was just kind of hanging in midair. Starboard side wasn't as bad. We like to use G10 as backing plates as opposed to aluminum or stainless steel, and one of the reasons for that is we can put them in with thickened epoxy, which allows us to even out that area and properly displace all of that load. So we took your aluminum plates off, we used them as templates, we cut some G10, and we actually epoxied those in place. Now that's when Patrick really comes into play, because he had to contour himself into some odd positions to get next to that water maker, and he's doing epoxy over his head, with the tools and with the
water maker.
with the water maker. We clamp with the bolts that we're going to use to mount. So we'll coat the bolts with a mold release wax. We'll put on the thickened epoxy on the plate, hold it up in place, and then put the bolts together and let that hold. And that allows the epoxy to get distributed evenly, but it also then allows everything to hold in place where you want it to for the cure time of that epoxy. And then at a later date, if you need to, you can actually still release it and break that free so that you could pull the arch off if you want to do something different in the future.
It became very obvious to me once you and Patrick really dove into things that this would have been a project that if I had tried on my own, it would have taken multiple months. I mean, this was just the amount of tools and equipment that you guys had on Sabado to do this work. It was, I was going to say overwhelming. I will say impressive. It's a lot of stuff that you need.
You guys were troopers living in a construction zone for 2 weeks. I mean, we had almost every tool out of our van on your boat at one point. I mean, that's kind of typical how jobs go. You start thinking you only need a certain set, and then we start going and going. You start pulling more and more stuff, and before we know it, the van's empty and everything's in your cockpit.
Yeah. Well, I can say with certainty that it was worth it. This has been life-changing for us as boaters.
That's what we like to hear. You know, the charter boat work is nice. We don't mind working on a lot of these charter boats, but really our passion is setting these boats up for off-grid living like you guys are doing, especially thoughtful, where you guys have done it for a little bit, you know what you really like, you know what you don't want to do, and that helps us design a system that really is going to meet your needs.
Well, I just want to say thank you for the work that you guys have done, especially since now it means that I get pizza and chicken wings.
And ice.
And ice.
Yeah, so we did bring you guys something because we said we were going to have a margarita day when we finished everything.
Oh, yes. Nice. Thank you, Patrick. Oh, yeah. Well, we still are going to do a margarita day.
Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, this is good, too. Clearly, you guys give Patrick the most uncomfortable work.
His title in the business is Certified Marine Contortionist. So.
He's bent around the engines in the engine compartments. He's laying against the davits doing solar work. You guys just...
I think somebody made a comment on the first video about him using a ratchet strap as a safety harness too, because he was ratchet strapped to the to your pole for your wind generator to drill out a bolt, to drill a screw that was stripped.
That was OSHA. Oh, I did have written down that maybe you wanted to say something about the generator going and not doing that anymore.
Nah.
Okay.